Okay, do you need the microphone or
No,
works there without? Okay, great. Okay, and how long do we have till? Also very important question.
40 minutes. 20 minutes.
40 minutes. Okay, got it. Fine. So, what do you guys want to know about anti-Semitism? I can tell you what I would say about it, but what would be helpful to you? What would...
It's about leadership. So we want to be able to take something away that we can put into practice.
Put into practice. Okay. So let's start with the theory, and then we'll see if that helps shape the practice. I'm not going to give actual particular direct strategies, but let's understand where is anti-Semitism coming from. And to do that, we have to first define what we even mean. Anti-Semitism is a very bad word for it, because it has had lots of iterations. Let's call it Jew hatred for now as a placeholder. Has had many iterations in history, and what the Jew thing that was being hated is shifts quite a lot as well, because the Jewish people is not simple to define. Are we a religion? Are we a race? Are we a nation? In the Western categories, we don't neatly fit. So Christianity is a religion. It's not tied to birth. It's not tied to a place or a people or anything. Islam the same. Judaism is not that way. You can be born into it. In fact, if you're born a Jew, but you can convert into it as well. So it's complicated. Is it a religion? Is it an ethnicity? Is it a nation? It's got aspects of all of them. And therefore, what it is that is officially targeted under anti-Semitism shifts. In the 19th century, it became popular to talk about racial anti-Semitism, the racial Jew hatred, the hatred of the Jewish race, and that was where the word anti-Semitism was coined or became prominent to describe a dislike of the race. The reason that's a very unhelpful word is because the vast majority of people who would qualify by what is intended by the word anti-Semitism don't hate Jews because of their race, which leads lots of people who are anti-Semitic or have anti-Semitic attitudes or beliefs to not think they have anti-Semitic attitudes or beliefs because they have no desire to have any bigotry against people because they're racially Jewish. Okay, so what is anti-Semitism? What is really meant by Jew hatred, Jew demonization? Well, let's ask it slightly differently. In what way does it differ from the regular bigoted dislike of the unlike? Humans do not like people who are different to them. They have a natural fear, a sense that you're not part of the same group, and if you're not part of the same group, that group could threaten you, and all sorts of hardwiring in our tribal brain that tells us we should have some suspicion or dislike of the unlike. And that occurs to Jews as well, but I don't think wildly disproportionate to how it occurs to everybody. So what is it that we mean that's the extra sting or venom or element of the Jew dynamic? And here there's, I think, two major pieces. I'm going to talk partly from a secular perspective, then we'll talk maybe from a Torah perspective, okay? If you had to analyze from a purely secular perspective, you would say that there is an obsessive social need for Jew demonization. Whatever in a society represents the collective Jew has to be associated with whatever that society relates to as demonic. Okay, whatever the society thinks is the most evil thing, the collective Jew has to somehow be associated with it. That's the core of what anti-Semitism is. Jew demonization. Taking whatever represents the collective Jew and associating it with whatever represents collective evil or mass evil. So that can be achieved in different ways. Either you take something collective Jews typically are doing and turning it into something evil, or you take something evil and imagine Jews are doing it. Right? You can do it in both ways. You can redefine the goal so that what Jews typically do is now redefined as something bad. I'll give you an example of that. That is a good example is money lending. Right? For a large part of medieval Europe, Jews were Europe's money lenders. The reason was that people can't lend money, are not likely to lend money outside of immediate charitable cases or friends or family. They're not going to lend you money if they're just likely to lose it, if they can't make any profit on it, because most people you lend money to, or a significant amount of people, you're investing in their farm, their future business, are not going to ever pay you back. So you have to make a profit. That means you lend with interest. Now, a Jew can't lend another Jew with interest, but there isn't a biblical prohibition. The Torah only has laws for the citizens of the Torah state, known as Jews or Israelites, right? That's all it has. And it doesn't apply those laws outside the state. So on the contrary, if somebody comes from outside the country, you should lend with, you can lend with interest though. But inside you don't. But when we're in exile, so at one point the rabbis actually did forbid lending with interest, but That was for a completely different reason in the Talmud. It doesn't apply nowadays. So we lend with interest. But a Christian couldn't lend with interest to another Christian. And a Muslim couldn't lend with interest to another Muslim. And so we were the only people who could lend money, and so Jews were brought in to be money lenders. And you can understand that people do not like money lenders. Money lenders charge interest. Interest compounds. Some of the people who needed money in the first place might have been poor. Sometimes they're states, and if the state has to pay you back, everybody has to pay more taxes. So there's all sorts of reasons why people do not like money lenders. And you can imagine a society being fiercely against money lenders. The problem is, for this theory or this concept, and so long as Jews were money lenders, money lending was considered equivalent to their war crime. It's considered a very evil thing by many, many people. And that was a big driver behind some of the expulsions, a big driver behind pogroms in certain cases, a big driver behind despising Jews, hating Jews, and so on. Now, and then attacking Jews. Then about around the 16th century comes the first major shift in which Jews are kind of usurped from their financial role as the big money lenders and generally replaced by, let's say, Italian banking families. So we all know the history. What happened was, around that time, anti-Semitism diminished and people started persecuting Italian banking families, and expelling them from countries and hating them and blaming them. No, now Jew hatred shifts to something else. Okay, so now it might be poor people stuck in ghettos. Because if you're poor in ghettos, you don't have the same sanitation and health as ever. So now you're responsible for rats and diseases and scrounging off society. Right? You can imagine someone doesn't like that. Then the Jews are let out of the ghetto and they rise up prominent in society. And other people are the poor people living in the rat-infested neighborhoods. And suddenly that's not really such a crime anymore. That's just like money lending was no longer a crime. It's just now a feature of economic life, an important one. Now poor people's not a crime anymore, and the Jews are not that anymore. Now it's the nouveau riche, it's the new rich guys taking over society. So you see that? So in other words, one option is what Jews do becomes demonized, right? The next option is you take something demonic and pretend it applies to Jews. So blood libels is a very good example. Now, it probably is the case somewhere in history they were Jewish murderers. I mean, the statistical likelihood that there were never Jewish murderers is very small, right? Just, I mean, which society, which population never produced somebody horrible who kills people? The likelihood that somewhere in the whole of human history, a Jew killed a Christian is probably not zero. But this concept that Jews were killing Christian children to use blood in the matzahs was seriously believed by massive swathes of humanity, and still is believed by certain percentages of humanity. And that's taking something people imagine as extreme evil, taking a religious ritual involving murder, and associating it with Jews with pretty much zero basis, right? So you've got example one, taking something Jews are doing and in your head ramping it up until the fact that somebody somewhere suffers now makes you the most evil. And on the other hand, you take an evil and imagine that somehow attaches to the Jews. They both work. But what anti-Semitism is in its core is a kind of social pathological need to associate the ultimate demonic things with the Jewish people, whatever represents the collective Jewish people. So in days when, let's say, Christianity was the dominant way of thinking of the West, so there, obviously, deicide is very, very naturally the worst thing you can do, is clearly associated with the Jews. That's right in the New Testament. The New Testament more or less absolves Rome of their responsibility and shifts it onto us, and depending on how you read the New Testament, possibly shifts it to the collective Jew forever after, right? Okay, but then Christianity is replaced as the dominant social paradigm by nationalism. So now nationalism's great fear is the people who are not nationalistic. And suddenly the Jews become accused of this dual loyalty, and you're not really loyal to us, you're not really part of our nation, right? And then you kind of get the extreme of that, which is racist and racial, and pre-war wasn't even necessarily a bad word, right? You're anti-say, don't like this race of people who are, don't connect anywhere. And now, so then post-war, when everyone got this kind of shock of, oh my goodness, we actually committed a Holocaust against these guys, now the ultimate sin is racism, apartheid, genocide. So now guess what? The Jewish collective becomes the state of Israel, and now it shifts there, right? Now, you Jewish collective are racial, genocidal, apartheid, what else? Colonialists, all the other bad stuff. So that's the trajectory of what anti-Semitism is. Now, where did it come from? Why did it happen? What are we meant to do about it? So let me start secular and shift more religious. The secular answer, I think, the best secular answer you can come up with, I'll give two secular answers. Okay, the best secular answer is to do with the fact that, if you wanted to be secular about it, to do with the fact that at the core religious texts of the biggest religions that have much to do with us, of Europe, Middle East and Southern Asia, namely Christianity and Islam, are basically texts about Jews. Right? So Christian, they've got the Tanakh, which they call the Old Testament, they've got the New Testament. They're all about Jews. Maybe not the Book of Eo, but everything else. Right? It's all about Jews. You're reading about Jews. The good in the Jews, the bad in the Jews. God chose the Jews, God rejects Jews, God this Jews, that Jews. If you're a Muslim with the Quran, it's not quite as extreme, but it's more or less the same. Right? The Quran is where it gets into narrative. The narrative is about Jews. The most mentioned person in the whole Quran is Moshe Rabbeinu, as Moses, by far. The main people spoken about in the Quran, both ancient and in those days modern, is Jews. So whether you're a religious or not religious Christian, and whether you're religious or even not religious Muslim, your sacred texts are going to make it very difficult to have no opinion about Jews. You know, if you were to say that, we just treat Jews like we treat, Malaysians or whatever, the likelihood of that is small for people who read their texts and have any emotional relationship with them. They could have, and throughout history people have had, positive interpretations of those texts. We always focus, and rightly so, because you need to care a lot more about them, the anti-Jewish people. There's always been a lot of pro-Jewish people. Sometimes usually there's a lot more anti than pro, but even if there are not a lot more, they're more important to focus on because they're more dangerous. They could kill us. But you have philo-Semitic pro-Jewish ways to read those texts and anti-Jewish ways to read those texts. Ways to read those texts that will make you like the Jewish people, and ways to read those texts that will make you hate the Jewish people. But it's not easy to be indifferent about the Jewish people. One way or another, they are the center of the sacred story, for good or for bad. So when Jews are the epicenter of the sacred story, for good or for bad, you can expect society to have a very different level of passion when it comes to their association with the word Jew than other groups. Some will be passionately pro us, lots will be passionately anti us, but there's going to be a very disproportionate amount of people who are passionate, okay? And within that will be a huge number that are passionately negative, especially because the plain reading of the New Testament, the simplest reading, is that at some point God rejected us and replaced us, and that starts to raise weird theological reading and punished us in that act. It contradicts the plain reading of Tanakh and almost any plausible reading of Tanakh, and that creates a tension for Christians to have to deal with, right? But that's a very natural reading of the New Testament. The Quran is not a narrative, so it's harder to create natural readings full stop, but it's still pretty natural, and since at least the 10th century BCE, it's been dominant to claim anything nice about the Jews in the Quran to apply to Jews living in the world around. So all these things lend themselves to that. So that would be the most natural explanation for anti-Semitism. Now let's shift it a little bit. There's a very famous set of research on the following. Let's now talk a little bit, still in this domain of the secular before we shift to the domain of the religious. Still in the domain of the secular is Hitler's anti-Semitism. And this came to the fore in a number of studies since the 1980s. During the 1980s, the president of Israel in those days was called Herzog. I think he might be the current one's something, I don't know. Some relation, uncle or I don't know. But uncle? I think so, yeah. So he commissioned, I think in 86 or 87, an interdisciplinary academic study based in Hebrew U about anti-Semitism. And again, it's a long time since I've read any of this stuff. I seem to recall, I was a kid at the time, I was reading about it in the Jerusalem Post on holiday, I remember that. And I think one of the opening lectures was given by somebody from Rutgers University, a sociologist, who identified why anti-Semitism isn't just racism. And he said, from an academic perspective, there are 4 things that make it unique and worthy of study. How long it's been going on for, right? We've got recorded history from literally as long as the first recorded writings of any serious size, Greece and Rome. We have its geographical and cultural spread. Most hatreds are concentrated into groups who are obviously not like them. And here, any culture with a large number of Jews for large numbers of time develops some kind of something. Number 3 is its intensity. There's certain patterns to hatreds, including localized expulsions and massacres of populations once some kind of belligerence opens up. But there's nothing like what's happened to Jews. First of all, depending on the word genocide has 3 possible meanings. One is the attempt, the word that was originally coined for after World War II, the attempt to hunt down and kill every single member of a group wherever they are on planet Earth. That definition may only have happened to Jews. It's possible. I'm not sure if it happened. It might be other people as well. Definition number 2, which used to mean, is the attempt to kill, at least within a region, every single member of a group or every single member of a part of a group, typically the men, right? Like in Srebrenica, that was the famous thing. The attempt was just to kill the men, not the women, so that was also called the genocide. And definition number 3 is anything the state of Israel does. That's okay, fine. Given that one, Jews are the perpetrators. But given the first 2, Jews are the primary victims in history. Okay, so that's very strange. Why would one group keep showing up again? And if you take definition number 2, Jews have had genocide so often in history. I don't know if they've had a third of all the genocides in history, or half, or even more. I'm not sure what the number would be. But it's huge. And so why? And it's not just that. Whole tortures were created just for Jews. And then the 4th category is the irrationality. That means to say, you could say all hatreds are irrational, but they usually serve an obvious interest. For example, dislike of the unlike can galvanize a society that's fragmenting and blame everything. It's a good scapegoat. A political leader wants to distract everyone. It's all the black people's fault, or the Vietnamese people's fault, or the Muslims' fault, or the Christians' fault, or the Jews' fault. Fine. But the level to which states will act against their own self-interest when it comes to persecuting Jews is quite unique. That's what he said. That was the 4th category. And he gave some examples. Expelling Jews was often economically catastrophic, but lots of states did it in history anyway. Sometimes they did it to escape debts the state owed Jews, but often it was just on ideological religious purity. We run a Christian country and no Jews in it. But it would be very self-defeating for the economics of the state. The almost exception was Spain, because it happened to be that year they discovered America. So they managed to stay economically wealthy for a little while. But even then, Britain took Jews in because they thought that would help them beat the Spanish to the trade routes of America, and it worked, right? But many countries expelled Jews, and it was a complete catastrophe, and it was a completely predictable catastrophe for them. Yeah.
From an ideological Christian perspective, would it make sense?
No, that might make sense, but the point is that whereas rarely do you expel people from a country, you find another way to persecute them, which is like, you rarely do it when you know it's going to be against your own rational self-interest, and Jews will often dominate. But the biggest example, of course, was World War II, right? Anyone who studies World War II knows the German military was weapon for weapon, man for man, superior, certainly to the Soviets, deep into 1944. But they lost the war because of logistics and production power. They could not keep up with the Soviet industry, ultimately. Right? Admiral Zhukov's great move, relocate 100,000 factories east of the Urals as beginning of Operation Barbarossa. And now, you would therefore think logically that the last thing they want to get rid of is a slave labor force. Put all the Jews to work producing bullets. The Bialystok ghetto literally produced bullets for the German army. That was their way of trying to stay afloat. And when the SS orders came in 1943 to liquidate them, the Wehrmacht, the German military, begged them not to because they're producing bullets. We're short of bullets. We can't keep up. And there was back and forth for 3 months, and in the end they got liquidated. It didn't make rational sense. Not in that you need every train you can get going east, deploying soldiers, bringing things back, and they're busy. The SS is busy deploying trains all over the place, killing Jews. So that's a very good example of against rational self-interest. Now, because of that, and because of another factor, which is that anti-Semitism is the only hatred where when its cause goes, the effect doesn't go, bless you, right? In history, hatred, so again, you've got a racist society, a white racist society, blacks were suffering. But the more the society becomes unracist or anti-racist, the more the blacks will do well, as a general rule. I'm not saying they're fully equalized to whites in a Western society, but they're not slaves anymore, there's no laws segregating anymore. You know, the way people were treated in the 1960s or the 1860s is not there today. And that's, as the cause diminishes, so the effect diminishes. The Jewish people, it never works. Whatever the cause is, if the cause goes tomorrow, a new cause enters. The effect stays. There's still demonization, still blaming the collective Jew for whatever society thinks is evil, and there's still going to be expulsions and persecutions and massacres and whatever else going on. And that's the thing we need to understand. So, a very interesting piece of research, or set of pieces of research, was done about Adolf Hitler, partly because he's the most notorious anti-Semite who ever lived, partly because he's the one who took it to its logical conclusion, and partly because he actually said he hated Jews because of something Jewish. You should know, by the way, it's very interesting, if you ever heard the seminar, Why the Jews, I don't know if they still teach as they used to, point out that that people, especially Jews, hate the concept there might be anything Jewish about anti-Semitism. We like to just universalize it. And especially Jews who are turning a bit against their Judaism will do everything they can to universalize it. The more assimilated a Jew is, and especially if they're more in the ashamed of being Jewish category, the more they will just turn anything that's happened to Jews and make it non-unique. So a very good example of this was the Anne Frank diaries. Now, Anne Frank, in her diaries, they wanted to turn it into a Broadway production. They did at one point. And they faithfully took lots of stuff in her diary. And there's one line there in her diary when she asks, why is this happening to the Jewish people? And she gives her own thought as a young child of what she thinks. She writes, maybe it's we're the people from whom the world learned so much morality. Maybe that's the reason why we now suffer. We cannot just be Englishmen or Netherlanders or like any other group of people, something like that. Now you can imagine that's an interesting insight. Maybe, maybe not. But of course it makes lots of people squirm, especially assimilated Jews. And so the Hollywood, Broadway producers who were probably assimilated Jews, not criticizing assimilated Jews, but just it's an uncomfortable thing to do. So they changed that text. And she goes, why is it the Jewish people suffering? Well, one day it's one group and the next day it's the next. There's people around the world who took Holocaust studies departments and turned them into genocide studies departments, right? Not that there's anything wrong with studying genocides, but when you turn Holocaust and genocide, what you're really saying is it's just one of those things that happens to lots of people, right? And often those same people turn around and go, look, Israel's committing a genocide. And then they get quoted, the professor, the guy who turned the Holocaust thing into genocide studies, then said Israel commits a genocide, which is what, typically started saying it decades ago, etc. So, but why are people so uncomfortable? Because it's much easier to explain it as a universal thing than confront the possibility there's anything spiritual, special, something about it. Hitler was very blatant. It's because they're Jewish. And what was his justification? Here's hard. I want to warn you that a lot of sources get quoted on this that are from a fellow called Hermann Rauschning. Who was Rauschning? Rauschning was a political ally of Hitler who flipped sides before World War II. Okay? And he wrote a series, bless you, of what he called unpublished speeches of Hitler. I don't think they were notes. I don't think they were things he typed up live. Maybe some were. But I think a lot of it was his memory, which means already you've got some distortion in. A lot of people don't take him too seriously historically because he was clearly an enemy of Hitler who was trying to get warn the world about him, but that means he might have been exaggerating using a lot of rhetoric. However, when he talks, that might be true when he tried to warn the world that Hitler would do World War II. He did try to warn the world of that. There'll be a war for world domination. And a lot of people didn't take him seriously. And maybe in retrospect we should have done. But especially when he talks about Hitler's views of Jews, at that point that would not sway political opinion in Britain or America. That wasn't something high on any politician's agenda in those days. So that makes him more and more reliable. And there he builds a very coherent story. And you can see parallels this story in the work of a work called Hitler's Table Talk by, I think, Cameron and Stevenson's, a very big professor of anti-Semitism, especially of Hitler's anti-Semitism, Robert Wistrich from the Hebrew University, and they converge upon a very similar story. And it goes like this: that Hitler deep inside was not so deep inside. Hitler was influenced by a genre of thought that was prevalent in some Germanic circles of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is the Darwinian view that animals progress by survival of the fittest, and social Darwinism was the view that humans progress by survival of the fittest. And therefore, so long as humans were out in the jungles and in the early Neolithic Revolution, the strongest humans were conquering the weaker ones, and the best genes were surviving, propagating, and so on. And in Hitler's view, the natural position of the world would be that Aryans would be on top. So that's social Darwinism. And there's lots of quotes from him that support such a view. If you are a social Darwinist at that time of history in Europe, you have a few ideologies that are getting in your way. They're telling people not to be conquerors and murderers and fighters and so on. Care about the weak and the poor in a society. And what ideologies would those have been?
Ours.
What's that?
Ours.
So Jews were one group. What else?
Christianity.
And what else, especially in early 20th century Europe? Communism. Right? Communism. In different forms: socialism, Bolshevism, but communism in particular. So Hitler has three natural enemies, let's say. Now, what Rauschning told us, and what actually happened, is Hitler had a plan for dealing with the communists. The plan was to invade Russia at some point, shut down the Communist Party wherever he was, let's say starting in Germany, ban the books, ban the party leaders, etc., etc., etc. Now, Rauschning gets a bit controversial when he claims that he had the same plan with Christianity, because then people think maybe he was just trying to whip up Christians against Hitler. But he claimed they had more or less the same plan, that he couldn't destroy the church now, but eventually he would love to get rid of the church, get rid of the clergy, shut down the churches, ban the books, and so on. Now, assuming that's true, what's the logical extension when it comes to Jewish people? What should his solution to the Jewish problem be? Close down the synagogues, ban the clergy, ban the books, shut down the yeshivas, etc., the schools. There, Rauschning says Hitler had said that would never work, because he says that a Jew, even if he's never been to Hebrew school or never been to synagogue, has it in him. I think he uses the phrase he would be a fresh germ center, der Bezillenheit, I think is, for fresh sedition. Right? The Jew is like this virus of this kind of ideology. And he writes that Christianity and communism basically came from Jews. Look who started them both, right? What was Karl Marx? What was Jesus? What was Paul? Right? So he sees this pattern that Jews have this strange thing inside them that makes them want to care about the weak and the poor and fight against hierarchical societies and some spirit. And he uses the phrase, the Jew has inflicted two wounds on mankind, circumcision on the body and conscience on the soul. These are Jewish inventions. And so we're seeing a picture that to get rid of this, what you might call ethics, morality in the world, it's not enough to get rid of ideologies, not enough to get rid of Judaism. Every single Jew is a potential carrier, it's in his soul, and therefore have to all be killed. Now, Rauschning is the first person to articulate a Hitler vision that would lead to what Hitler actually did. And again, there's parallels to that in others, he just writes it the strongest. And that offers the following interesting thought, that there's a part of humanity that hates godliness. There was a Catholic priest, I think, Edward Flannery, wrote one of the most important works on anti-Semitism called The Anguish of the Jews. I think it's a multi-volume work going through basically 33 centuries of Jew hatred. Really, to this day, one of the classical texts of anti-Semitism. And he was asked about this kind of view of anti-Semitism as a hatred of God. It's almost like God has these ambassadors in the world. If you hate God, you hate the Jews. And he believed in that theory. And somebody said, well, what about Christian anti-Semitism? There's so much hatred of Jews that's from Christians, and Christians don't hate God. He said a very interesting answer. I hope I'm quoting it accurately. You can check out yourself. But he said, when a Christian feels a resentment against God, and lots of people feel resentment against God subconsciously. Lots of people don't like moral order, but they can't consciously let themselves say they hate God. Right? It's like psychotherapists who help clients suddenly realize they're carrying a lot of resentment to their parents, but their conscious brain won't let them have it, right? So with God, it's even more. You can't. Your righteous, religious brain can't say, I don't like God, but people carry this resentment. And where do they channel it? Flannery said they channel it into hatred of the Jews. Subconsciously in their mind, they associate through their biblical studies that God gave the law, the moral law, to the Jewish people. And when they hate God, they hate the giver of the moral law, and they hate the receiver of the moral law, and they hate the Jews. And when their conscience tells them they're not being good enough, they look at the Old Testament as the God of conscience. Vicious, or too demanding, and vengeful, and scary, and the bearers of that and the believers in that are the Jews. And therefore there's this kind of hatred of conscience becomes associated. The Jew is associated with conscience, and therefore the hatred of conscience becomes hatred of the Jew. Right? That, of course, coheres very powerfully with something Chazal say, or they say it in different forms in different Gemaras and Midrashim. That basically they play on the phonetic link between Sinai and Sinah. Torah is given at Sinai, and Sinai is phonetically, not etymologically, not the letters and spelling, but the sound is related to the word Sinah, hatred, because hatred came to the world. Either the hatred of God to those who do evil in the world, and those who rebel against God, idol worshipping and so on, or a hatred from those people to God and to the people who took on his law. It's a two-way relationship. And that, amazingly enough, Rauschning actually uses that expression. I don't think he's familiar with the Talmudic quote, but he says that that again and again the dull and the base in mankind, or the insoluble, there's some line, I forget that, are in revolt, right? When they think about the Jew, and he goes, it is like the eternal call to Sinai against which the dull and the base in humanity are again and again in revolt. That's the line. There's some call to Sinai that mankind is rebelling against. That's a fascinating thing. In other words, there's a sensitivity to the extent to which Judaism changed the value structure of the world. And of course, any of you have heard the talk World Perfect, you'll be familiar with this. And if you go back in time, all the things we hold today to be self-evident truths, all the moral things that all major societies agree on, we disagree on a lot, but all major societies agree on some level of human rights, right? All. They might disagree on when you lose the right to life, but everyone agrees you start life with it. All agree you don't just walk up to an innocent baby and kill them, right? All agree that every child has a right to an education. All agree that you have social responsibility. We might disagree to how much, but their society is judged by how it treats its weakest and its poor. Okay, some may push that much further and sacrifice liberty for it, others not. But all agree law should be fairly distributed to everybody. Everyone should be subject to the law. Right? All agree peace is better than war. Now, if you went back just 2,000 years, certainly 3,000 years, you would be hard-pressed to find societies living that way. Most of them killed children if too many were born. Right? Infanticide, Aristotle writes about it. It's not just brutes and barbarians. They kept population control by killing children. Disabled children who wouldn't be productive workers were all killed in most societies. Education was always concentrated to the children of the elites. So when you were using hieroglyphs and cuneiform and this kind of stuff where it took years to learn the writing, fine. Most kids were farmers or working long before they could read, fine. But once the alphabet hits the world and moves across societies about 3,500 years ago, at that point, every society could have taught all its kids by the age of 4 to read and write, or most of them. Why do they not? Because they don't want the masses to have education. Why? Because they're power-driven societies. And the best thing the elites can have is make sure no one else can read or write, because then no one else can take over the empire. Right? War was considered better than peace. In the ancient world, war was associated with godliness, literally divinity, goodness. A good leader was meant to conquer territory. That's why Alexander the Great is called great, not because he built great hospitals, because he literally pillaged and plundered and mass murdered. Today, genocided his way across the whole. But that's just how the ancient world thought of things. He was considered divine because he got to the gates of India. All these values, justice equally, societies have different levels of justice for Group A versus Group B. If Group A conquered Group B, they had different legal systems. And Group A and B conquered Group C. There's now 3 legal. In ancient Babylon, you had 3 systems. In China, at one point, you had 20 systems. These were all the revolutions the Torah brought to the world, amongst many others as well. Monotheism, right? But it brought it, these are very radical ideas that the Torah introduced to the world, that everyone's creating the image of God, that killing a disabled person is a bad idea, right? Is murder. That if there's too many kids born that year, you work harder, you farm more, you don't kill them. That peace is the ideal, not war. Right? God's promised peace. The nations of the world, we don't say they're all going to be Jewish, they're all going to come to the house of Hashem. Nation will not lift up sword, nation won't lift up sword against nation, right? They won't even learn about war. These are all very, very radical biblical ideas. Every child has an education. The Gemara says you excommunicated a town doesn't have a school, etc. Social responsibility, you judge a society by how it treats its poorest. The idea of a Supreme Court, the idea that every citizen, including a king, is subject to the law. These are crazy ideas in the ancient world, but they don't spread through us. They spread through Christianity, they spread through Islam, right? They spread through the founders of America who believed the Catholic Church wasn't living up to the biblical ideals, etc., etc. Some even say early communists were often accepting biblical texts with the word God deleted, but they're spreading through the world. Now, we're not modern liberalism, we're not Christianity, we're not Islam, but the common root of all of these is they are all Judaic in one form or another. Relative to the pagan world, these values are not Greek and Roman or Babylonian or Persian. These are Jewish, Torah. And so you can imagine one who resents all that carries a natural resentment to us. So that's now shifted towards the religious side. There were some hands up, so I'll take questions before I get to where I wanted to get to. When are we meant to finish? Now? 3. Oh, I've got time. I thought 4. 3. Okay, so I've got 8 minutes. I've still got 8 minutes. Okay, fine. Okay, good. So, no, that clock's wrong. And I was looking at it a few times there. Oh, wow, no time's passed. Okay, so there's one more aspect which I think, because very important to understand this. Anti-Semitism sweeps society more than it sweeps individuals. One of the worst things we did in my opinion, in Holocaust education, was to pretend that the 1930s never really happened. What happened is like some monsters swept into Germany and took over society. you walk into any Holocaust museum, you see this Hitler standing at the front going, well, mass orgies go, like these monsters or dehumanized people, and then you see the book burnings, then you jump straight to the Holocaust. 1930s Germany was some of the most sophisticated, acculturated, tolerant, democratic people who've ever lived. I don't know if a society has developed as much cultural advance as pre-war Germany. They were broken a lot by World War I. They were in economic ruin. Before World War I, they were the top of the world. They were, so much time, my grandmother grew up in Pressburg. I mean, if you weren't in the poorer Jewish communities speaking Yiddish, the richer Jewish communities in the cities, you learned German as a first language. You wanted to be part of cosmopolitan high society. From home, you learned German. The Übermensch, the upper people. And that society was traumatized by World War I. It was broken by the economic collapse. And in that society, a rumor begins to spread. An idea begins to spread that World War I's, all your pain and problems were generated by the Jews, the mysterious hidden Jews, the bankers, who had funded World War I. The bankers in Germany at some point stopped funding their war and therefore stabbed in the back. All this kind of narrative began to develop. Look, there's anti-German Jews in Poland and anti-German Jews in Britain, and therefore it was the Jew who stabbed us in the back. Right? Now, at the beginning, most Germans didn't go for that. Some did, but it starts to sweep relatively quickly, and then it starts to become more mainstream. And then the university professors some of them start saying that, and then the university students start saying that, and the legal departments are saying it, and the politicians are saying it, and the media people are saying it, and the people who are defending the Jews start saying, well, I'm not so sure, I don't know, maybe, right? Germany's Jews are responsible for all your things. Not all Jews, there are some good Jews. There are Jews who fought in our side. You can't put them in the same bucket. There were even Jews who supported the National Socialist movement, who were always wheeled out as, see, we're not against all Jews, there's some good Jews as well. And they could always stand up and say, yes, the Jewish collective hates Goyim, and they want to kill you all, and that's why they destroyed you in World War I. The anti-Jewish Jews, the ex-Jews who were National Socialists first, then Jews second, remember their parents and whatever, and that was the trajectory, and it was a very natural movement. And the average German wasn't, I personally hate Jews, but they were swept along in this, and that I guess maybe it's true. I don't know enough about it, but maybe if all these guys are saying so, they can't all be wrong. My grandfather left Germany in 1935. After Nuremberg rallies, he was in Leipzig, and after he saw the professors and the college and university students and the legal people, he left. But most Jews didn't see it happening. So anti-Semitism sweeps a society. Today it's aimed at Israel. And everyone's like, well, how can you legitimately criticize Israel? If you're obsessed with Israel, and if you're obsessed in a negative way, you've been swept by anti-Semitism. Of course you can criticize an Israeli policy and so on, but if in your mind they have to be monsters and Nazis and you can't stand and you only focus on this, you don't have to be an anti-Semite yourself, but you can be living in a society that has absorbed a huge anti-Semitic narrative. And because it's a social phenomenon rather than an individual one, again, you get lots of people who don't realize why they think the way they do. Here's the last bit, which is the bit that's also worth focusing on. Then if I've got 2 minutes at the end, I'll say something about where that puts us in leadership positions and so on. The other thing is positive, and that is that I think anti-Semitism also comes with a cry of help. You see, a world obsesses about a people why? So the world obsesses about Jews partly because somewhere in their subconscious is a voice that says these people are meant to be solving your problems. The same thing that Hashem says to Avraham Avinu. However you read the grammar of Nivruchu v'chakol mishchais Adama, through you will be blessed all families of earth. Okay, so Rashi says they will consciously bless themselves to be like you. Yitzchak gets V'sbaruchu b'zarach kol goyei haaretz. That's quite clear that the blessing to the nations of the world will happen through your seed. Yaakov gets V'nivruchu. You're meant to be the source of the solution to the Garden of Eden problem. You're meant to be the people who have taken upon yourselves the responsibility to bring God's light into the world again, to heal the world. So if the world is a mess, whose fault is it on some level? So now the subconscious of the world says, Jews, they're responsible for what goes wrong. So the United Nations every year, I always say, if an alien would come down from another planet and try and figure out what's the biggest issue facing planet Earth. So they go, 1 second, can we speak to the world leaders? They gather every year in New York. Okay, let's go and listen to them. What do they make resolutions about this year? What did they make last year? What did they make for the last 15 years? And they look down, there's global warming somewhere. That's an issue. Okay, a few resolutions about that. Slavery, a few resolutions. Poverty, that's an issue. Then there's one issue that dominates all others. 70%, 67% every single year. There's a people on earth called the Jewish people in their Jewish land, and they're just not good enough. We've got to criticize them. That's it. That's what humanity thinks its primary issue is. That's the truth. They can say they don't, but judge people by their actions every year consistently when the world's leaders gather. The topic they think top of the list, more than double importance than every other topic put together, is the nation of Israel is not good. Implication, subconsciously, if this people Israel would sort themselves out, the world would be fine. Every other problem would be dwarfed. See that? Now start to think, now consciously that's not what people are thinking. Consciously they don't understand their emotions. They don't know why they have a rage against this. But that's going on. And what that means in the conscious mind now is, in the fringes of society, or not so fringe anymore, is if Jews are responsible for everything wrong, then Jews are responsible for 9/11. Jews are responsible for world wars. Jews are responsible for everything going wrong. Charlie Kirk getting assassinated. So the conscious brain says, oh, conspiracy. Where's the conspiracy? There's this hidden Jewish thing killing all these people, right? It must be Jews killed JFK. It must be, the Jews killed Charlie Kirk. In that crazy mindset, it's coming from this linkage. So what that means for us is like this, a few things. First of all, yes, you can call out anti-Semitism and people should want to. Second of all, lots of Jews become acutely aware of their identity because of anti-Semitism. And in a way, it's a bad thing because you shouldn't have a negative sense of identity. But in a way, the positive of it is, why does evil hate you? If Osama bin Laden and Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler all disagree about everything, but they all agree that their enemy is the Jew, if evil always says it hates you and you're its fear and its enemy, that's something to be very proud of. Darkness hates light. If darkness always has the same target, then that target is a potential source of light. Maybe it's not doing enough of it. We often don't realize what the anti-Semites realize about us. The third thing in terms of the practical is the message to Jewish people is, if they hate what Jewishness is, and they hate you because of Judaism, then maybe learn about the thing they hate. Learn about the light that darkness is fighting against. Become more Jewish. Be more a part of it. Be proud of it. And the fourth thing is internally as well. We have to understand that our responsibility to Hashem and to the whole of Klal Yisrael, to getting the Jewish people back on track, who we're meant to be. We're meant to be the shining light to the world, consciously and subconsciously, but we're meant to be. And world history is waiting for us. And that's a big responsibility, but it's one we're going to have whether we like it or not. You can't run away from it. Because we can ignore it, but the world doesn't. And the eyes of the world are on us. And think about the opportunity in a modern social media world. If we could produce whatever the perfect world would be right now for Klal Yisrael, and eventually a perfect Torah state and a perfect Hashem presence in the world, the whole world's looking at us. Every improvement we make in that way, everything we do that can be easily a chilul Hashem, can be flipped around and easily be a kiddush Hashem. The world is looking at us, and the world's waiting for us. And that is the extra dimension to understand in leadership. Klal Yisrael is meant to be Melechos Kahanim V'Goy Kodesh, right? Priests in the ancient world were typically people with privilege, but in Torah, priests are people with responsibility, and leadership really is about responsibility. If you look at Tanakh, you will see this very, very clearly. Almost no great Jewish leader wanted leadership. They didn't go on leadership courses. They usually said no when they were first offered a position that involved power. But eventually Hashem said to them, the world needs you. Most of them were shepherds first, right? Right? Responsibility. Responsibility starts in your own daladamas, in your own room, in your own family, in your own roommates and everything, and then it moves outwards. But we are responsible. We have responsibility, and the world knows it and understands it. And that is and understanding that and communicating that to other Jews is very powerful, and communicating it to ourselves is very powerful. Right? The world, it's like, somebody who runs away from the Gemara to switch on social media. And what does social media say? Jews aren't being good enough, right? We hate you Jews, darkness hates you, everything hates you. It's like your little reminder of, oh, the world is looking at us, right? Either back to the Gemara or back to putting it into practice or back to building that world that Hashem wants us to build. And that's it. Okay, so I think that's what I wanted to say. Then if there's questions, a little time for questions even, but that sounds worth it.
That was amazing.
Religious text theory.